Hello, everyone. And on behalf of Elders for Earth, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for attending this evening, and especially a welcome to Brother Richard, our guest. As usual, the session is recorded and it will be made available online later on, and you'll get the link for that. So first of all, Terry will introduce Brother Richard, and later Maureen, with your help, will engage in some conversation with him, and she can share your comments or your questions, but please feel free to participate yourselves then, using the chat, and we really appreciate your participation. So, later on you can unmute yourself to do that too. So thank you very much, and I'll hand you over to Terry.
Thanks, Mary. So hi, and I'm a volunteer with the steering group. Terry O'Sullivan is my name, and the steering group, as many of you will know, is a branch of the Community and Development Project known as SHEP. So this is our 11th talk, and we're delighted to have Brother Richard. So just a brief line or two about what we're about. So in Elders for Earth, in this series, our intention is to combine the concept of eldering and activism for climate and biodiversity issues. And we also recognise the importance of cultivating a spiritual foundation as an important support in the work. So Brother Richard is currently guardian of the Capuchin Friar in Raheny, Dublin. He has worked extensively with youth and teacher training programs, combining mindfulness theory and practice with techniques and teachings drawn from the world's greatest teachers. He has several publications on the themes of mindfulness and meditation and contemplation. Brother Richard believes that prayer and poetry go hand in hand, which is, he has written several poems, including one entitled Lockdown, which went viral in 2020 in the early stages of the pandemic. So there's a lot more to Brother Richard, which I couldn't even begin, because he's got a great background in working with youth and youth programs and all kinds of retreats. So I have very fond memories of Brother Richard, because I first met him when he was chaplain in UCC, and he was very supportive in securing UCC as a venue for several retreats in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. And the Cork Mindfulness Sangha greatly appreciated his effort and enthusiasm to this end. So I won't go on, because I'm sure he's an awful lot to share, and he will give us more of his background and his work in his sharing, and we're delighted to have him here. So very welcome, Brother Richard.
Thanks, thank you so much, Terry. It's a great gift and privilege to be with you, and to be invited to be with you and to be with such a group of people. So this evening I have the great gift and privilege of sharing with you a little of the Franciscan tradition and how it speaks to the eldering of the earth, or the eldership that we inherit as human beings, as brothers and sisters, as part of the great chain of being. I'll do that by speaking a little bit about St. Francis, situating the tradition where it comes from in its kind of historical context, and then how it can speak to us today, if that's okay. I'm just going to do a really quick little sound check with you all, just to make sure you're all hearing me okay. If I can get thumbs up around there, it's always polite to make sure we're all okay. Excellent, good stuff. That's great, thank you. So I'm just going to share screen as much as I'm able to, just to bring this little presentation up, and hopefully you're able to see the slides as we go through this. So the topic, as I was given it, was how to bring something of St. Francis to this conversation that you've been having, to this movement that you're part of, to the work that you're doing. And immediately a line from the great Canticle of the Creatures that St. Francis wrote, which we'll talk about later, came to my mind, which was our sister Mother Earth. This was the title that Francis gave to the earth beneath our feet. He personifies creation, not just in a poetic way or in a metaphorical way, but in a way that allows him to be someone who is in dialogue with the rest of creation. And the Franciscan vision ultimately is one of what we call cosmic fraternity or sorority. The idea that we are simply brothers and sisters of all that is. Because if everything in the Franciscan understanding, if everything comes from a divine creator, a divine father, a divine parent, however you want to envision that, then that automatically makes us all part of one great family of being. And as we know, with family goes responsibility and care and empathy. So in order to arrive at that point where we can, like St. Francis and like so many of his images, live an open-hearted and an open-handed life, we enter this way of brotherhood, this way of sisterhood. So for those of you maybe who don't know much about St. Francis, and I'll move through this very quickly. This isn't a history lesson this evening, I promise you, but just for those of you who might like to know a little bit about him. He was born 1181, 1182. We're not entirely sure. Record keeping wasn't exactly as good as it is today. He was born at a time when the feudal system was beginning to creak and give way a little bit. His father was one of the new up-and-coming middle class. He was a cloth merchant and very, very famous, very, very wealthy. So much so that even as a middle class man, he was able to marry a noble woman, the Lady Pica, who came from France, probably from the south of France. Francis, by the way, his name wasn't Francis, his name was John. He was named John by his father, but because he picked up beautiful French from his mother and spoke French very well as a child, he was known in the town of Assisi as Francesco, the little Frenchman. And that's where we get the name Francis of Assisi from. His father had great aspirations that Francis would do better for the family, do more for the family, ennoble the family. And so a couple of times he sent him off to war. With all of the best gear, hoping that he would do well in the wars and would be made a knight. And indeed, it was Francis' own aspiration to be made a knight. But very quickly, he failed in this endeavor, was mugged, lost all his gear, and ended up in prison for about 2 years, it taking that amount of time for the family to raise the ransom, to be able to ransom him home. As a result of this, he fell into a great sickness. And the sickness was not just a physical one, but a kind of an existential one. He began to question, what's it all about really? That great question that hopefully afflicts all of us at some point in our life, that changes so much for us. And this question polarized itself into two distinct movements of his heart that became really his inner prayer, his inner mantra, which was, who are you, God, and what am I? Who are you and what am I? And immediately we see Francis entering into this relational understanding that in some way, if he can pierce the meaning of his own life, he will enter into this kind of cosmic relationship. Various dreams followed, various signs followed, the most important one of all being his encounter with a leper on the road, the lepers being the most excluded, the most lost people in that society. There was actually a religious rite of expulsion of a leper, by which the leper came under the church's protection, which meant that it was a sin to hurt a leper, but at the same time they lost their name, their family, their property, and were forevermore commanded to wander the roads begging. They weren't allowed to enter towns, weren't allowed to see family face to face. They had to stand downwind of you. They couldn't wash in water that would be used for drinking or washing. And even when it came to church services, they had to stand at the church windows and look in. The service, to all intents and purposes, was a funeral, and it included a symbolic sprinkling of earth on the leper's head so that they would know themselves as both banished and buried. They were absolutely excluded. And it was a terrible thing to touch them or to be touched by them. But Francis, in the midst of this existential longing and praying and meditating, met a leper on the road, and something moved him so much so that at the end of his life, the one spiritual experience he recounts at the very end of his life is this one. He goes forward and he embraces the leper. He sees in the leper a reflection of himself. Logically, maybe the leper within himself, but in some way he sees the Christ present in the leper. He then gives away everything that he has and decides he's going to live the life of a hermit. There are other plans for him, however, and very quickly others come and join him. And when they do, this little brotherhood decides that they're going to try and live the gospel as fully as they can. Eventually, he receives the first Franciscan woman, St. Clare, his first female follower, and she begins the second order, as we call it, second in the history of its foundation. The first order being the brothers who went with him, the second order, the sisters, giving themselves more completely to contemplative life. And then finally, he founds the third order, which is for lay men and women who are going to live the gospel while still living family life in the midst of the world. He also gives us the crib, and he is the first, as far as we know, to receive the stigmata, that mystical gift of such representation of Christ's passion in his heart that it becomes a visible representation in his body, the wounds of Christ appearing in hands, feet, and side. And in 1226, at the age of 44, having lived the spiritual life for only about 20 years, he passes, he has his transitus, his passing to the Lord, his passing into ultimate union with God. He leaves behind, after 20 years, 44,000 brothers, about 22,000 sisters, and probably well over 150,000 lay people who have decided to live according to his example. It became such a fast and growing movement that one bishop said it was far better that Francis had been a Catholic, because otherwise all the Catholics would have become Franciscan. So that's Francis as he moves through life. But I suppose if you ask anybody generally who St. Francis is, very often they'll go after, Francis the bird table, Francis the one who stands with arms apart singing the praises of God, maybe sort of a hippie-ish saint, as somebody once called him to me. But he was a man who was simply searching for ultimate meaning and trying to find healing in that meaning. So for Francis, prayer, the place of prayer, is what it's all about. The idea of recognizing that prayer is something, meditation, contemplation is something that restores balance, that restores peace. In the Christian tradition, we would call this shalom. Shalom is not just the absence of conflict, it is a rebalancing of the self so that we are in right relationship with the divine, with all of creation, with ourselves, and with all others that we encounter. A place of kind of perfect peace and perfect knowing, a place of right action, right speech, right communication. So Francis and the early brothers saw that meeting God was the basic requirement for every believer. It had to be experiential. It had to be an encounter with the other, the divine other. And that encounter could take place in different ways, specifically through prayer, through the sacramental life of the church, through gathering in community, but also through the contemplation of creation itself. And so, as one of his early followers and biographers, Celano, says, Francis did more than just pray. It wasn't an activity. He wanted to become prayer. He wanted to become this meeting point with the divine. And so for Francis, the whole goal was to detach oneself from anything that could separate you from divine union. He insists on prayer all of the time. In his own writings, his whole thing was to say that nothing should hinder us, nothing should separate us from God's presence. And this means that every encounter with the other, no matter who that other is, no matter what that other is, can be viewed as a doorway into divine presence. He says in one of his rules for the brothers, let all of us, wherever we are, in every place, at every hour, every day, and continually, believe truly and humbly, keep in our heart, love, honor, adore, serve, praise, and bless, glorify and exalt, magnify and give thanks to the Most High and Supreme Eternal God. He was definitively an Italian in his use of adjectives. Over and over again, he lists more and more places. But Francis is born into and is part of a very deep sacred tradition. The Judeo-Christian tradition begins with the understanding that creation itself is fundamentally good. It is essentially good, and everything that exists is good because it comes from divine goodness, from the God who is good, as Francis himself would say. And in that wonderful depiction in Genesis, where we have the 6 days, where day by day God is naming each thing as good in its essence, good in its essence, we arrive finally with the creation of humanity, who are pronounced very good, or the utmost good, the essence of goodness being found in us. For Francis, our sin or brokenness had not effaced that good. It had simply made it hard for us to find. And so he goes back again and again to that idea of the naming of Adam and Eve. Adam coming from the Hebrew Adamah, the gardener, and Eve, Eva being the mother of all those who live. And in this masculine and feminine understanding, Francis and Clare found an instruction that we are called to garden the earth, to garden ourselves even as the place of the divine, to find again seeds of the divine and to allow them to grow. Very often in English, we balk at the words of Genesis that speak of, humanity, and particularly man, in that the male, dominating the earth, or, filling the earth and conquering it. But actually, if you go back into the language itself, into the proper language it comes from, and even the Latin language that dominion or domination comes from, it comes from a very, very subtle understanding of dominus, lordship, being an echo of divine lordship, which includes within it care, stewardship, minding. The dominus, the Lord, was the one who sacrificed all for the household, who was the protector and defender of the household, not someone that everybody else was to bow down to. The only reverence and respect that the dominus receives is when in their service of the household, they merit this reverence or this respect. So even though we find creation broken because of humanity's falling into selfishness, it's a creation that even in its moment of fall has its goodness renewed by God in the promise of redemption, the promise of peace. The church then is seen as a body of believers throughout all time, the ecclesia, the tent of the divine, who are founded as a conduit of sacramental grace. So in this sense, creation, all that exists in the Christian, particularly monastic, mystical, and Franciscan tradition, is absolutely holy. The way to approach creation is to approach it with reverence, with listening, with attention, to abide in creation as a divine word. St. Augustine, one of the early church fathers, puts it beautifully. He says, God has written 2 books in which his word might be read, the scriptures and the book of nature itself. Quoting him there, creation is a great book, note it, read it. God didn't write the book with ink. Instead, he set before your eyes the things that he had made. Can you ask for a louder voice than that? Heaven and earth cry out to you, God made me. And in the Franciscan tradition, the understanding is that when we sit with creation, when we care for it, when we allow it to be our teacher, to sit as a disciple before creation, then creation has a whole other language of the divine, a whole other gospel to speak to us, a good news to invite us into. But this only happens when we're living in communion with it, when we slow down enough, reflect enough, become mindful enough, aware enough, contemplative enough to be able to see the Logos, the divine word, who speaks its word through creation. So for Francis then, this meant that creation could be seen as a contemplative ladder, as something that invites us to rise above ourselves to the fullest extent, to the best kind of person we can be, because creation will teach us how best to live according to the divine mind. Again, St. Bonaventure, one of the great mystical teachers of Franciscanism, and a man who knew Francis himself as a young man, describing the way Francis viewed creation, says, aroused by all things to the love of God, he rejoiced in all the works of the Lord's hands. And that's a very important thing for Franciscans. The fruit of our connection with creation is not a kind of a dour-faced sadness or sourness or seriousness. It's joy. Joy. When we behold what is true, when we behold what is beautiful, when we behold what is good, then joy is the only response to that. The motto of the Franciscan order is Pax et Bonum, peace and joyful goodness, joyful goodness, pax et bonum. So Francis rejoices in the works of the Lord's hands, and from these joy-producing manifestations, I love that phrase, he rose to their life-giving principle and cause. In beautiful things, he saw beauty itself, the divine. And through his vestiges imprinted on creation, he followed his beloved everywhere, making from all things a ladder by which he could climb up and embrace him who is utterly desirable. Now, the problem of the image of the ladder is sometimes we can have this idea that, you know, we encounter the created thing and immediately we jump to the creator. I sometimes think that rather than a ladder, it's more of a slide. It's a kind of an understanding that when we encounter, the first thing we will encounter is through the senses. And it's important to be with the senses as fully as we can as we encounter whatever, whoever the other is. And to really rest with them, to be present in them, to allow them to unfold their meaning and to tell their story at their pace. And as we know, creation tells its story at a very different speed and pace to our speed and pace. It's about slowing down to the pace of the sun, the pace of the moon, the pace of the seasons, the pace of that autumnal letting go, that spring renewal, that summering that sits with us forever, or seemingly forever, and then, you know, being in our wintering, being in our retreating, in our inner rest, even in our inner death. So this led Francis towards the end of his life to create a piece of work which comes down to us today as being kind of the codified essence of the Franciscan vision of creation. And this is what he called the Canticle of the Creatures, or sometimes he referred to it as the Song of Brother Sun. It was written in 3 distinct stages, marking 3 different parts of his life. One after a period of very deep retreat, one after a period where he was working as a peacemaker to reconcile 2 towns that came together, and he completed it. The last line of it was completed on his deathbed just before he died, just before he passed away. So it's very precious to us. It's also the first poem ever to be written in Italian, in what's recognizably modern Italian. Francis was a man of the people, and as well as the monastic chant in Latin, he wanted the friars to sing the songs of the people, to be with them in their ordinary songs. Indeed, he used to sing the songs of the troubadours, the lovers' songs, so that people, when they would hear those songs, would think beyond them, not just of earthly love, but of the divine love that calls us all into being. And so as a wonderful canticle of creation, it pictures the contemplative Francis in this case, but all of us really, as being someone who is surrounded by a family of creation that is continually speaking to us, continually talking to us. And as we reflect on it, it begins to open out to us the beauty and the power and the grace that's hidden in all of these ordinary things, but so necessary things for us. And so this is where the Franciscan cosmology appears, this fraternity, sorority, this brotherhood, sisterhood, which also means, as I mentioned before, approaching the other always as an equal to the self. I had a very interesting conversation some years ago with a very lovely, very, very good man who was found it really scandalous to think that in the Franciscan tradition, we could call, you know, the animals or the plants our brothers or our sisters. Surely he just meant this metaphorically. Surely he just meant this as a way of kind of a poetic expression. And what we find when we look into the life of Francis is that it wasn't metaphorical. It was a real approach to the other as equal that allowed real communication to take place. And so we've all of these wonderful stories of Francis preaching to the birds and preaching to the wolves and taming the falcons and having the insects come to him when he wanted them to, and even speaking to what was known as insensate nature, fire and water, and having them respond to him. But this is what it was originally envisioned a human being would be. We forget at our peril that even though it's metaphorical and poetic, there is a truth in Genesis, which is that the original intention of the divine was that humanity would be the guardians and the caregivers and the communicators with all of creation. That original invitation that God gives to the man, the Adamah, the beginning, to name creation is not about putting a stamp or a seal or a kind of a hierarchy on nature. It's actually about knowing the inner nature of the thing so that one is able to communicate with it directly rather than through feeling oneself separated from it in some way, as so many of us do. And so Francis returned to this. We speak of him as someone who returned to a pre-Edenic consciousness, a unitive consciousness with the divine and with all that is. And so this song of creation, this canticle of the creatures, which I'll share with you now in a moment, is a psalm of union. But it's not just the union of Francis as a holy person up on a hill that we could never aspire to being. Francis is tracing this as a path for all of us, a path that we can walk, a path that is open to everyone if we simply slow down enough and get off the high horse of our ego and begin to recognize the other as equal, brother, sister, however we encounter it. Some people often ask, why did he call it, why was one thing a brother and one thing a sister? It was very simple. Italian is a gendered language. The nouns are gendered. So it was very easy for Francis to say brother sun and sister moon. And I don't think it really matters whether that's the way you envision it in your consciousness. What's important is recognizing the familial element of it, that we are arriving as part of a family. And when it's family, then it means I can trust the other. I can trust the other to fulfill their function. I can be supported by them. And I, in turn, offer my support to them. So moving into that little poem, that little canticle, if we can, he starts in a very cosmic way. He starts by recognizing the origin point. And so we begin with praise of the Most High. And I'm just going to read you some of the text as it arises. So he begins with the invocation of the divine. Highest, all-powerful good Lord, yours is the praise, the glory, and the honor, and every blessing. They belong to you alone, Most High, and no one is worthy to speak your name. This is a very formal way of beginning, and it was a way in which a knight would address their king or their lord at that time. But it also has a very important point, which is the Franciscan tradition and the Christian tradition is not pantheist. It doesn't see nature as divine in itself. It is panentheist, which sees the divine as abiding in creation, but also being beyond creation. We can know God, we can know the divine, we can love the divine in and through the attributes of the divine, but the divine in the divine's essence is always beyond us, is always mystery. There's always more to know, more to see. And so Francis begins from the point of mystery. He moves then immediately into the life giver, the one who has the greatest image of life-giving, which is the sun. So praise be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Sir Brother Sun, who makes the day and enlightens us through you. He is lovely and radiant and grand, and he is your herald, O Most High Lord. We begin with the sun, the origin of all life, the origin of all creation. There is nothing without the sun, and especially in the Middle Ages, when light was candlelight or firelight at the most, the coming of the sun, the need for the sun in all of its seasons is so important. In the early life of Francis, we think of Assisi and Umbria now as beautiful golden fields and lovely summer days, but they got very hard winters. In fact, they were in a kind of a mini ice age at that time for about 20 years or so. And so the coming of the sun was so important, so needed. He moves then to the moon and the stars. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister moon and the stars, for you have hung them in heaven, shining and precious and fair. Whenever Francis encounters the feminine, the kind of knightly Italian appears. It's always about the beauty of the feminine and the beauty of the divine reflected in and through the feminine. And so when he comes to his sisters, he bows down in reverence. And we'll see this again as he comes to some of the others. Praise to you, my Lord, through brother wind, through air and cloud and calm and every weather that sustains your creatures. I love this one particularly because it's about the idea that, you know, as I think it was Billy Connolly famously said, there's no such thing as bad weather, only the wrong clothes. And it allows us to enter fully into that idea that whatever is the season now, whatever is the moment now, is speaking to us. It has a relevance to us. And I like this little picture. It's a modern version of one of the miniatures from the time of St. Francis. It shows the brothers huddling away from the wind, but Francis turned towards it, totally flowing with the wind in the direction that the wind is leading him to. And praised be you, my Lord, through our sister Mother Earth, who nourishes us and teaches us, bringing forth all kinds of fruits and coloured flowers and herbs. Francis returns again and again to this idea that the earth is both mother and sister. We come from her in our physical substance, and our physical substance will return to her. And then she is also our sister. And as a sister, she cares for us, teaches us. In that sense, Francis has this tremendous reverence for Earth as mother, origin, divine womb, the presence of all things, but also this idea that we can also approach her as one equal to another, as one member of creation, one member of the divine family to another. And this allows us to be present to the earth as she produces everything that we need. Francis returns again to this Edenic vision of the fact that and as a vegetarian, I suppose I can say this, that the understanding of the early book of Genesis was that we would only, all of us, animals included in this beautiful metaphorical, poetic way, be feeding on the plants of the earth, not on each other. Francis, in his understanding of creation, though he wasn't a vegetarian because he was someone who depended on the charity of others, insisted that the brothers would have tremendous reverence and respect for their food, for the understanding of where food came from, the understanding of the effort that went into it. And he saw begging for one's food as going to the table of the Lord, because everything ultimately came from the divine. Yes, and praise to you, my Lord, through brother fire. Through him you illumine our night, and he is handsome and merry, robust and strong. Think of the power of fire. And to some extent, we've lost our connection with it. You know, easy to switch on the gas or switch on the electric fire or flip on the light or whatever. We've forgotten maybe the effort that went into making a fire. I think of my grandmother, and her morning task just wasn't over until the fire had been set for the evening ahead. You know, that the house was kind of safe and warm once the fire had been set. And as our young people get further and further away from this, you know, they're further and further away perhaps from the necessity of being able to sit with the fire, rest with the fire, allow the fire to speak to you as another party, as another person. I remember some years ago in Dublin's inner city visiting some of the little flats and houses there, and very often elderly people who are living by themselves would tell you, I don't feel lonely once I have the fire. I don't feel lonely once the fire is there. It's another person, it's another presence in the house. And I think it is. It speaks to us of the divine in so many ways, and reflects that glory in so many ways. And then he speaks of sister water. Praise be you, my Lord, through sister water, so very useful, humble, precious, and chaste. Again, the necessities of life. If we saw water really as our sister, if we saw water as the way in which God seeks to bring us into preciousness, purity, chastity in the fullest sense of that word, which basically means pure-heartedness. If we really saw it as jewel-like and precious, what a different world we would be living in now, where the commodification of it and the pollution of it and even the fighting over it is something that takes from its inherent nature to pour itself out, to give itself continually to creation. And having spoken of of that part of the family, Francis turns to our part of the family. And he speaks of us in a very particular way. He says, "Praise to you, my Lord, through those who forgive one another in your love and who bear the sicknesses and trials of life. Blessed are they, for they live on in peace, and they will be crowned by you." Again, our part is not just to be who we currently are. The rest of creation is perfect in its essence as what it is now. But for Francis, humanity has some fixing to do. We have to move into reconciliation, healing, forgiving, bearing the ups and downs of life in a way that accepts them as not as good in and of themselves, but as something that can purify our intellect, purify our ego, bring us into the understanding that we are all simply brothers and sisters, as Rumi famously said, walking each other home. And so it's only when we move through that we begin to recognize the fundamental part of ourselves, which is we are a being meant for eternity, but only able to enter eternity through the temporal now, and especially through the experience of death. Francis referred to death always as sister death. And the Franciscan was supposed to meditate regularly on sister death, who is the closest of our relatives, he would say, who is with us every day, standing just at our shoulder. And eventually will come the moment when she puts her hand on our shoulder and tells us, time to go. And when we meditate upon sister death in this way, she's not frightening anymore. Because what's frightening about a sister inviting you home, as opposed to something that we fight against or are terrified of or find difficulty to be in the presence of? This is what he says about death. "Praise to you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no one living can escape, the great equalizer. How dreadful for those who die in sin, how lovely for those who are found in your most holy will, for the second death can do them no harm. Oh, praise and bless my Lord, thank him and serve him humbly but grandly." So for Francis, death is not just the leveler, but is also the one who reminds us about the inner reconciliation work that we need to do, so as to be one with all of creation, so as to be one with all of these great brothers and sisters of ours. On one occasion, when speaking about creation, I'm going to find the quote exactly for you. He speaks of how humanity fails the Creator. And I love this. He puts it beautifully. He says, "Consider, O human, the wondrous dignity God has conferred upon you. He created and formed your body in the image of his beloved Son, and your soul in his own inner likeness. Yet all the other creatures under heaven serve and know and obey their Creator in their own way better than you do. Why? Because they simply are what they are, whereas we spend all our life trying to be other than what we are." For Francis, the inner spiritual detachment that confers peace is a turning away from desiring that reality would be other than it is. In other words, grounding oneself perfectly in the real, in the present moment, where God is, where God speaks, where the life of the gospel is, and then moving out from that into a renewed network of relationships with all that is, which actually does bring about change, but the change is now brought about by our willing to place ourselves as a brother or a sister amongst the communion of being. And so for Francis, this searching for peace was at the heart of what it was to be a pilgrim, to be a brother or a sister, whether in the order or outside of the order. Indeed, it was what was essential to be simply a human being. So much so that down through the ages, he's become known for the peace prayer, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. I'm sure you're aware of it, you know that prayer, or you've heard it, or you've heard it sung or whatever. Francis never wrote this prayer. It's a Franciscan prayer. It comes out of the Franciscan movement from meditation on the life of Francis, but Francis himself didn't write it as far as we are aware. But it sings, in a way, the inner meaning of that search for peace, because it's this idea that if I am brother to you, if I am sister to you, then I will go directly to the place of your hurt, of your pain, and I will be present with you there. So it sets me more as a kind of a servant of compassion in the world, rather than as someone who is self-satisfied, cut off, separate from everything, domineering, as opposed to the dominus, the one who serves, the one who minds, the one who cares for those along the way. And this to me speaks beautifully to that whole idea of eldership. In the Christian tradition, in the Franciscan tradition especially, there is the following of that very traditional life cycle understanding of where eldering is. You know, the traditional view of so many societies, so many indigenous societies, was that the human being moves through three distinct stages: a kind of a warrior survival stage, a sort of a poet creative stage, midlife, creating family, creating society, and finally the elder, the sage, who's about the integration of experience and an invitation to others to enter wisdom. Sadly, as we all know, our modern 20th, 21st century has sort of turned that on its head. It has removed the elders to a large extent. And it has said that the warrior stage, the kind of adolescent stage, is the goal, and one should try and stay there as long as possible. Well, like all of the wisdom traditions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, all of the indigenous traditions, exactly the same. Once one is centered on wisdom, you find the same three stages. The Christian understanding was the same, that there was the disciple who was being called to train in inner listening, the apostle who's then sent with the message. But the one that we hear least about, maybe, is the one who was called to be the steward of the mysteries. The one who simply is, who incarnates the divine not through word, but through being. And when that level is reached in the spiritual path, a level that we all aspire to, I hope, but when that level is met, which is the level Francis was looking for when he said, "Who are you, my God, and what am I?" What we find is this entering into peace, this entering into communion, and also an advocacy for our brothers and sisters as well. Francis insisted that the brothers would live in such a way that they lived lightly upon the earth. And so even in places that were given to them, the gardens and the grounds, while they were to produce the food, naturally enough, of the friars, they were to be farmed in such a way that there was always a wild part of the garden. In the famous forest sanctuary of Laverna, where he received the stigmata, he decreed that the friars could only use as firewood or as fuel the branches that had dropped naturally from the forest. They were not to cut a tree or take anything down. They were to do their best to share the resources that they received as fully as they could, and they were to if they were leaving a place, they were to leave it gently and with great courtesy. And so what we see in Francis is someone who is again and again and again encouraging the brothers and the sisters to come back to this idea of a community of life that allows creation, both the human and the non-human, to be in dialogue, to be in unity, and to recognize we are part of one great family of being. And I think what that does, if we bring it into our eldering for the earth, if we bring it into that path, is that it allows us to begin to live in a way that really follows what elders traditionally did. Traditionally, they held the story, the cosmology, the story that bestows meaning. And the elder, by living out of it, shows to the other what's possible. Imaginations are only stimulated if they can be shown what is possible. You can't say to someone who has never known a sunrise or a sunset, you need to see one or it's beautiful. You need to bring them there. You've got to show them the gift that's there. Elders also initiate the next generation. So any form of eldership that's just about a group of people looking at each other and saying, isn't this all terrible? We need to mind this, we need to change, but not reaching out as obviously you're doing in terms of your advocacy and your action on behalf of the earth. That's dead eldership if that's not there. And they call to integrity and wholeness while knowing that this is always a work in progress. Francis finished his poem of creation in his very last breath And I don't think we can expect perfection any moment before that. But I think it's possible to call to integrity while still being honest about the disintegrated parts within ourselves. Within the Christian understanding, we would have seen this as flowing with the Holy Spirit. And Francis said that no work should be undertaken unless it encourages the flow of the Holy Spirit, the flow of divine breath, divine life. Because this in turn bestows discernment, wisdom that then allows us to live in right action, right speech, to live at the right time, doing the right thing in the right way. And this was the original understanding of monastic obedience, that it guaranteed this. It wasn't a kind of an obedient, an unquestioning obedience. It was an obedience that rose out of a deep inner listening to the elders, to the masters, to the teachers, and to the divine within. And if that happens, then we begin to live at a balance of both meaning and purpose, the fruit of which is real compassion. A compassio, a being with the suffering in such a way that the suffering is transformed by our presence, by our witness, and by our action. That's what Francis offers to us, I honestly believe. That's what he has asked of us, this kind of transmission of wisdom that allows us to recognize that in the here and in the now, these ancient masters and teachers from all the different traditions, very often speaking in very similar ways, invite us into encountering the other as a place of sacred revelation. One of my teachers put it like this. He said, "We keep holy days to remind us that all days are holy. We venerate holy people to remind us that all people are holy. And we bow down in holy places to remind us that all places are holy. And that if we could really arrive at a place of real inner stillness, inner attention, and inner peace, we would realize that every bush is burning." So that's what we're hoping for. That's what we're entering for. That's what we're trying for. And one of the projects that's currently underway as part of our Franciscan eldering is with Ard's Friary in Donegal, northwest Donegal. This was originally a place that we used for many years for the training of our own brothers. And then as that training moved into different directions, we had this beautiful friary on 150 acres of pristine forest and coastline, which we are the guardians of. It's interesting, Francis wouldn't allow the superiors in the Franciscan tradition to be called abbots or fathers. They were to be guardians, because you were guarding the space, guarding the land, not just the life of the brothers as well. And if you want to know more about what's going on there, the Centre for Spiritual Ecology as it grows, you can find out all about it at eldersforearth.ie. But I'm going to finish my part of this, the speaking part. You'll all be very glad to hear, by finishing with a poem. Terry mentioned that poetry is very important to me, but this is not one of my poems. This is a wonderful poem called St. Francis and the Sow, and it's by the poet Galway Kinnell. I think it speaks beautifully to everything we've spoken about here today. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen, and then let's have a listen to this. The bud stands for all things, even for those things that don't flower. For everything flowers from within of self-blessing, though sometimes it is necessary to re-teach a thing its loveliness, to put a hand on the brow of the flower and retell it in words and in touch that it is lovely, until it flowers again from within of self-blessing. Just as St. Francis put his hand on the creased forehead of the old sow and told her in words and in touch blessings of earth on the sow. And the sow began remembering all down her thick length, from the earthen snout all the way through the fodder and the slops to the spiritual curl of the tail and the hard spininess spiked out from the spine, down through the great broken heart to the sheer blue milken dreaminess spurting and shuddering from the 14 teats into the 14 mouths, sucking and blowing beneath them, the long, perfect loveliness of sow. So thank you for your attention. And I'm going to hand over to Maureen, I think now. If there's any bit of reflecting or questioning, feel free.
Thank you, Brother Richard.
Thank you.
It's hard to say anything after that. I'm just really full up, and I can hear the monastics of Plum Village speaking in the same language. Maybe you're choosing different words. So I'm really full. I'm really full, and I had a couple of ideas to start the conversation, but first I want to check and see if there are people here with us who would like to speak or have a question or a comment or a reflection to add to the fullness. We can all be sows. So, and I really enjoy your poetry, and I don't know if you've published a volume of them yet, but I would encourage you.
All this is the plug point now. All things being equal, there should be a book coming out before Christmas.
Wonderful. I'm delighted to hear that.
All things being equal, hold it in your good thoughts, your prayers, your good vibes. You know, there's many a slip between publisher and bookshop.
I understand that. I understand that. I was reading today the garden is burning. Yeah, very powerful.
We might finish with that tonight if that's okay with you.
That would be lovely.
Yeah,
that would be absolutely lovely.
Sure.
Well, I might ask a question just to get primer, so to speak. Or one of the things that I struggle with is the number of people who are heartbroken over what's happening with the earth and with each other, and who feel disempowered, who feel like there is nothing that they can do. I am only one person. So even if I take care of my garden, that's not changing things. If I study recycling from here to kingdom come, and I don't do it perfectly, I'm not making a difference. So trying to encourage people that everything that's done counts. And I think that I heard that, but in your presentation, in your reflections. So how do you approach or love the people who are feeling the depression? And I feel it sometimes, clearly.
I think it's important to feel the depression, as a spur to action. I think there's a difference between being sad about how things are and being exhausted by how things are. If you're exhausted, you need to rest. And that may mean actually taking your attention off this for a little while. And simply dwelling in the present in a kind and compassionate way. I think an awful lot of advocates and elders and people who are trying to live in a kind of a spiritual activist or an activist model, they disappear because they burn out, because they're simply trying to hold the world's pain constantly. I think it's good for us to touch the world's pain, because that pushes, as I said, into action. But at least in the Franciscan tradition, there is a surrendering to the idea that whatever you want to call it, the divine, the ultimate, the universal, that is actually holding everything. And so my task is simply where I am in the here and now, to do the best that I can in the here and now. And I think that's primarily by being rather than speaking and worrying and stressing. There's a lovely story in the Franciscan tradition about Francis saying to one of the brothers up on the hilltop hermitage, let's go down to the town and preach a sermon. And they go down and they spend the whole day, and you know, he encounters someone who needs help hanging out her washing, and he does that. And he goes into a house and there's an elderly man there who's can't wash himself anymore, and he does that. And they're all little acts of kindness. And all the way along, the brother is saying to him, when are we going to preach the sermon? When are we going to preach the sermon? And eventually it's too late to go to the church. So they turn around and they go back to the brothers. And the brother says, well, that was a waste of time completely. You know, we never actually got to preach the sermon. And of course, Francis was trying to teach him that the whole day was the sermon. So I think, of course, we want things to change. And of course, we want people to wake up. And of course, we want to kind of get the world by the scruff of the neck and shake it sometimes, particularly at the moment, you know. But in the end, there's something about needing to simply be the witness of the present moment in compassion. The brave person is not the person who plants a forest on a beautiful day. It's the person who's planting the forest as somebody else is setting off a bomb. And I think that's what we need to do, is to recognize that there is an energy of attentive, compassionate, positive love even in that moment. That even if, God forbid, the forest burns down, the energy of the act can never be removed. And it becomes part of that universal whole. And I think that allows us, in a gentle way, to kind of breathe out a bit and give ourselves a break from time to time.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to see if there are people who would like to chime into this conversation here.
I'm just wondering how important it would be to do some of that work on ourselves, you know, in community, you know, because like Maureen was saying, it's so easy to be anxious and worried and to burn out and to feel very isolated as well. And you know, and again, in our culture, we, you know, we're quite individualistic, you know, and, you know, and we do all this investigation and inquiry into ourselves a lot, you know, but, you know, working with other people or together in community seems to be the answer, but the task of that seems to be enormous, you know, to come together and find ways to come together and, you know, and building relationships, you know, as well as I suppose doing the kind of fixing that St. Francis even back then thought that we needed. I was kind of shocked to hear that, you know, whatever he witnessed or whatever was happening then.
Yeah, I suppose for me anyway, I think the community aspect is actually the most important. We really become who we are in and through the presence of the other. And that includes all of creation, but particularly for ourselves, I think there's something about the elder, even that to take that figure, the elder is someone who initiates the other, but into community, into a community of meaning. And I think one of the great things we need to kind of almost stand against is the isolationism of, you know, paralyzed individualism. We used to joke about the paralysis of analysis, you know, that if someone is just simply inquiring, the problem is that if you don't have the mentor or the teacher or the supporter or whatever you want to call them, who is able to actually pierce the bubble of your awareness, of your ego, of your even of your obsession sometimes, and actually make you smile about it or laugh about it or release it in tears or in joy or in laughter, then that can go on forever without you actually ever arriving at anything. And we all know those people, and to some extent we all run from those people if they don't have that openness that allows fresh air to be breathed in. And I think that only comes from community. So I mean, my thing would be to say a good exercise in self-examination is to examine one's relating. And if you don't have people like this, to seek them out. Because by and large, you'll find they're seeking for people as well. It's wonderful that this community can come together and think and ponder and contemplate and act. But it's also equally important that the community supports one another in the humanity of each other. I think that's really important, and that's where real brotherhood, sisterhood comes out of, you know. So yeah, I'm just agreeing with you, really. I think it's really important that there's that a community aspect, and a community is open. If a community isn't open, it dies. We're very, very good as human beings at creating the clique of those who agree with me. And if you only have people in your life who agree with you, then there is no growth for anybody. So it's really important to have the person who objects or disagrees or whatever, because I think that's where we get stretched. That's where we get to know the other fully. So yeah, open community, I think, is very important.
Thank you, and very challenging as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Hugely. I mean, it's so easy to run away from that. And is there any kind of gems of wisdom from the Franciscan tradition? You know, because I think we need a model for community. You know, something that works, and we also probably need to change ourselves. You know, and who we are identified with. Yeah. Sure.
One of the things I think was extremely important, and it was a totally new thing that Francis did, was that he insisted that all offices would be open to everybody, and that you only had a limited time in office. So even guardians or even the superior of the whole order, the successors of St. Francis, the longest they have in office is 6 years. And then they have to step down and check. Now, people can vote them in again. That's fine. That's what they want them. But there's this idea that you must be willing always to let go, to step back, to breathe new life and new air, to have the awareness to be able to say, I've done what was mine to do. And I'm quoting St. Francis now, I've done what was mine to do. May the Lord show you what's yours. And that means allowing the human ego that wants always, in all of us, to some extent, wants to control, to dominate, and to decide. It's a very good training if you know that I'm only here for a little while, and after that, I'll be going back into the body of everybody else, just as a simple brother or sister. It helps a lot when that's there.
So it comes to mind to me in that bit of discussion you had there, that one of the ways that you make community, like in a broader sense of community, you know, just the people who are living around you, is by asking for help. And that has come to me recently in quite a big way, because I needed help. I wasn't able to drive after surgery. And it's amazing how needing that help brought me into closer communication with my neighbours and people who lived around me, because it gave them an opportunity to be helpful, but also to get to know me better. And you know, they're all people maybe who have completely different ideas about many things, but through that one thread of connection, it has brought me into closer community. And yeah, I think sometimes, Mary was saying about how individualistic a society we are, and part of that individualism tends to be that we see ourselves as always able to cope, and you know, always being sort of not wanting to be that vulnerable, not wanting to be vulnerable enough to ask for help. And it's quite a big thing to get over for most of us, I think.
Absolutely. And I think what I was mentioning there before about the sort of disruption of the life cycle that has happened, if you exalt the adolescent is the only stage of life that wants to be completely by themselves. they view themselves as totally independent. We used to always smile when you would arrive at a point where you'd see families who were coming to church, you know, for a few years, and then suddenly you'd see the day where the family would walk in, and maybe 3 or 4 steps behind the adolescent would creep in, and that was simply because they needed the distance. That I'm not with them, you know. And then after a few months, they just wouldn't be there anymore, you know. So it's if we exalt that, then we're exalting a false independence. Because if we actually look at the way the older societies handled it, they allowed the adolescent to go through that initiatory, semi-independent time, but with elders standing around them at a safe distance. If we look at the rest of the life cycle, there is no other point in the life cycle where we're not invited into interdependence, into interbeing. And that's where we really become human. And so I think when we have those moments where we actually need to reach out and ask for help in whatever way, in some way, there is, I could go so deeply as to say, like, there's spiritual conversion in that, in the fullest sense of the word, because I'm having to abandon a false self, which was the independent self, because none of us are really independent, constantly dependent on everything and on anything, you know. And as St. Francis showed, like, dependent on the sun, dependent on the fire, dependent on the water, dependent on, so this idea that we're above it all or beyond it all or self-contained is the great lie we tell ourselves. That sort of gets us through the day, maybe, but actually impoverishes our existence. So when I can see you, Jane, as my sister, I can approach you at a level of equality that doesn't ask anything of you except to be my sister. And so then when there's a question of you asking me for help or me asking you for help, it's not just quid pro quo in a very calculated way. It becomes communion in that moment, and is very sacred in that moment. And out of that grows tremendous transformation. Yeah, the power of being able to say, help me, is a really wonderful thing.
Well, I think it opens up channels of, you know, of connection. We've become like quite loving connections very quickly.
Yeah.
And so sort of energetically, it's a really important thing to be able to do. And yet, I think so many thoughts tend to come up in one's head, like, no, I can't ask that. I can't do that. It's like there are lots of blocks for asking for help in our society. Yeah.
We're not trained in it. We're not taught how to do it. You know, the whole education system is about creating, to some extent, non-thinking individuals, non-reflecting individuals, whereas human education in the fullest sense of the word, as it took place for millennia in all of the different traditions, was really geared towards trying to create, in its essence, trying to create a contemplative way of being that includes within it the ability to say, I need help. And unfortunately, it's something we're all, myself included, we're all very poor at, but have to kind of continually remind ourselves to attempt, at least.
Just wondering about, you know, you work a lot with younger people and students, don't you? Younger group. I'm just wondering how they relate to all this, because it must be very. They have a great sense of community in their own right, haven't they? I'm just wondering how you find working with them in response to this kind of. I mean, a lot of them would have dropped formal religion, you know, what we remember growing up. So just a whole new way of being, and in relation to nature, what's your experience around what you've just spoken about with younger people, students, and maybe younger, you work with younger people? I'm not sure what you work with.
I think I'll answer that slightly backwards, if that's okay, just to give it to you. There is a huge movement at the moment called earth re-enchantment, or re-enchanting the earth. And it's about trying to once again bring the mythic imagination of humanity into contact with the wild, the natural, and allowing the communication of both the creation of story, the creation of nature as a place of play for adults as well as for children. I think it's a very sacred movement that's taking place at the moment. And it's something that at times can teeter dangerously on the verge of cultural appropriation, which is something I think the West has to be extremely careful about. But at the same time, it allows nature to begin to have a voice internally in our own self. What I've found working with young people over the last 20 years is that, not for all of them by any means, but for a lot, nature doesn't have a voice anymore in itself. There is the voice of, it's all falling apart, it's crisis, it's climate change, there's nothing we can do, the time is running out, and all of that is true. And there's a huge amount of energy to be gathered from that in terms of advocacy and action and change. But if the young person hasn't entered into a relational experience with the natural world, they won't value the natural world in and of itself. The natural world is still being defined as something I will save so I will be okay, rather than a communion of being, a web of creation, a divine gift, whatever way your mythic imagination wants to create that. And when I use the term mythic imagination, I don't mean untrue, I mean a way of seeing the truth. Just as science is a way of seeing the truth and history is a way of seeing the truth, mythic imagination is essential, and to some extent it's what makes us human. I can't remember the philosopher, but there was one philosopher who said that we should not be called Homo sapiens, wise man or humanity. We should be called Homo narrans, the storytelling man or humanity, in the fullest sense of the old Latin homo, meaning all of humanity. And what I have found is young people who have less and less ability to tell stories, who have less and less ability to actually encounter creation and nature as anything other than alien, dangerous, fearful, risky. And if we do that, and then we bring in a big wave of anxiety and worry because creation is going to avenge, it's going to kill, it's going to crush, this destabilization is the earth's revenge on us all. Like, those narratives are very present, and they're terrifying to young people. And they don't allow them into an encounter that allows love, communion, and value to arise. And as one American educator, and I can't remember his name, he's an extraordinary African-American educator, said, what you don't love, you won't value. What you don't value, you don't mind losing. And so part of the education that I've been doing, really, the work that I've been doing, is to try and bring young people into a sacred interface with creation again. And that can be as simple as a walk in the park where the senses are engaged and the phone is put away, where you're encountering silence in very small increments that allow the inner voice to be heard, because some of these young people will tell you they don't hear their inner voice anymore. The biggest surprise myself and a number of other facilitators got was, we were doing an art project and we asked a group of 10-year-olds to draw a house. That was it, just draw a house. And they looked at us with total incomprehension and said, "What house?" And we said, no, just make up a house, draw a house. But you have to show us the house and then we'll draw it. And I was really taken aback. And there was a lady there who was an art teacher, and she was saying, no, this is what I'm finding more and more. There is the imagination is a muscle. And what you don't use, you lose, as they say in the gym. And as a result, as again, not for all, but I think for a significant number, if imagination disappears, then the ability to see the possibility of anything being different or better, either in my own life or in creation itself, disappears. Mythic imagination disappears and creation loses its voice. The animals, the plants, the rocks, the trees, the sky, doesn't speak anymore. It's just there to be used. And I think we have to re-enchant in the fullest sense of the word, which is becoming silent enough to hear the song that's already being sung. Francis would call that the canticle of the creatures. He said he was only saying out loud what he was hearing in his contemplation. And I think that's what we have to do, is to allow the young people into positive experiences that aren't anxiety inducing, but that actually teach them the beauty and the power of interaction with non-human creation. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I answered it backwards. But there we go.
I agree. Yeah. And it's just how to get them to put down the phones, to actually leave all technology for a while. But even in small, that's wonderful though. Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the little things we did was we said, okay, there's massive anxiety if you say put down the phone or take the phone away, because the phone is part of them now. Mm-hmm. There is a generation who exists on the phone. Mm-hmm. So use the phone. Mm-hmm. So we got them to actually take photographs with the phone, but in macro, to find the shapes that actually they thought were beautiful, that it wasn't the selfie anymore, you know, me between the camera and creation, but that it was actually trying to find the beauty, the simple, the small, the tiny. And it got, you know, teenagers became like 5-year-olds running around the place, chasing ants, chasing butterflies, you know, and that's what actually begins, it cracks it open, that beauty can be seen again. And I think the other senses need to be used as well. You know, we live, especially now, you know, with having gone through the pandemic, allowing kids to get dirty, to climb trees, to touch things. Everywhere they go, they're told, don't touch, stand away, be clean, sit down, be quiet, you know, actually allowing them into the earth. As much as that might mean more laundry, it allows them at least to encounter. My sister is a Montessori teacher, and she told a wonderful story of the first time it snowed last year, and they brought out some of the kids who had never seen snow, just because of their age. They'd never seen snow. And they were terrified of the snow. They just wanted to go back inside. So they let them back inside, but the teachers stayed out in the snow and started playing in the snow. And of course, the kids then wanted to go out and play in the snow. And I think that's eldering. It's not forcing the child into an experience they don't like or don't want, but it's allowing the child to see that you value your encounter, your experience in a way that brings joy, you know, the fruit of joy. Yeah.
I think Peppa Pig has a lot to offer in that area with her.
Absolutely, absolutely. Roll in the mud, splash in the puddles. You know, it's I laugh so much that the kids are all sitting at home watching this, and the parents then tell them, "Don't do that." It's funny. Yeah, yeah.
They'll do it anyway. Oh, thanks so much, and thanks for
no problem.
Really beautiful. Thank you.
And it may be that we need to invite all ages to go out and play in the snow.
Absolutely. You know, the real elders are those who don't mind being a child.
Yeah.
The ones that I've met, and it doesn't matter what age they're at, but they were the ones who had lost that adolescent sense of poise. That's such a curse in the world, you know. And and just, now you have to go through it. We all have to go through it. It's part of our life. But I think if we get stuck with it, it's terrifying. Yeah.
Invite everybody in spring to do The World is Mud Luscious and Puddle Wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And even having that lovely, the freedom of the very old and the very young. You know, when you bring, and I think that's why the gift of grandparent or great grandparent with a child is often they have more freedom with them than they would necessarily have with the parental generation, who are naturally so focused on provision and work and all of that kind of stuff. You know, every generation is needed in that sense. Understanding. Yeah.
Absolutely. I wish we were in a place where we could invite each other to go out and play in the stream.
Yeah.
And sit with the tree and listen.
Yeah. It's all there. Yeah.
Maybe it's time for the pastors and the priests to come out of the cathedrals and into nature to do their celebrations, and also second level schools and primary schools to have their classes in nature.
Yeah, I agree.
And universities as well. So it's like, how can that be encouraged? Because it's so important that would happen, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I agree completely. I think the more, you know, sometimes people just don't like the chaos idea. They think it's going to be a negative thing. And you know, a little bit of chaos is good. Francis had no problem being chaotic, and brought an element of creative chaos with him wherever he went. And I think that's what the Holy Spirit does as well. I think the Holy Spirit, you know, doesn't just breathe over the chaos and bring order out of it, but sometimes throws a pebble right into the middle of it and causes the chaos to ripple. And that's very important too.
I think I will spend some time this evening imagining how to create a little bit of chaos.
Yeah.
And to have a really good time doing it.
Good.
Really good time doing it.
I'm glad.
We're kind of coming down to the time that we said we would end, but brother, would you share the poem with us, please?
Sure.
That's just an extraordinary poem. Thank you.
So this is called The Garden is Burning, and I wrote this, you'll hear the world events that were taking place when this was written, but it was written last summer. For a long time now, a fire has been burning in my mind. A flood has rolled across my heart. An earthquake rumbles in my soul. I am afraid it is breaking, this world of ours. How could it not? It bears so much weight. The weight of sadness, the weight of fear, the weight of pain. Last week in Greece, a 2,000-year-old olive tree, an elder, ancient and wise in ways we cannot even begin to know, burned. As people fled the lands that fed them and us for ages untold. The trees don't get to leave. Here in Ireland, we smile and take pictures of a walrus, a prince of the cold kingdom, now in exile, lost, wandering, alone, iceless, friendless, bewildered by boats. In Siberia, the tundra burns and the mammoth bones have their slumbering rest disturbed, long thought safe and sleeping by the peoples who live and love upon the frosted lands. In Afghanistan, a wordless groan erupts, the pain of a tortured soul, the ache of a land so long in agony its voice is near a death rattle, despair of a people fearing a veil being drawn over their faces, a stifling of song, an ending of hope, a blanket of hate and loss and loss and loss and betrayal. In Haiti, earthquakes again, In Lebanon, explosions again. In America, fires again. In Turkey, floods again. And my litany is nowhere near complete. Lord, have mercy. The world is breaking. How could it not? What was meant as garden needs its gardeners, needs us to be Adams, gardeners again, needs us to be Eves, mothers of life again. That was the original blessing after all, to grow, to steward, to bring forth life, to bless, to give thanks, to guard and keep all that lives, all that breathes, all that is. So what must I do? What can you do? Be a gardener now, right where you are. Dig. Dig deep within. Dig over the hard soil of the heart that cannot bear to hear anymore, and let it breathe again original blessing. Plant seeds of kindness. Plant seeds of compassion. Plant seeds of love. Water it with your tears for all the beings who suffer. Grow a harvest of tenderness for those who suffer. Grow flowers of welcome for the lost and the lonely. Grow the fruit of peace in yourself and offer it to all beings to eat. Act with reverence for all that is. For all that is holy. Allow that little plot of life and earth around you to heal. It will spread. Remember, we are all sons of Adam. Remember, we are all daughters of Eve. Hear again the song of Sister Mother Earth. Sing again the hymn of creation. Be again blessing. Be again the gardener. Be at last the steward. Be.
Thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you. Thank you for listening and for inviting me into your sacred space. Thank you so much.
Be careful, you may get another invitation. So
I'm always open to invitations.
Thank you.
No problem. No problem. If you like, I can email on some of those notes and poem, and feel free to send them out to anybody who would like them.
That would be wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I feel like I want at least a 12-hour conversation with you.
I look forward to it.
Be careful. I'll show up because I'm thinking about how what you've said integrates with Buddhist teachings and how it integrates with a group of elders. I was fortunate enough to meet the mamos of the Tayuna people in Colombia.
Wow. Yeah.
So have lots to think about for me, and I'm sure others do too. So thank you, Brother Richard. You're always welcome in Cork.
I look forward to Cork always.
Great.
Thank you. And if I could just say to everybody that's here, you know, it's very easy always to come in and to speak and to teach and to do all of those things. I'm struggling practitioner, struggling pilgrim, just like the rest of you. So please keep me in your prayers and thoughts and good vibes and peace and anything good that you can send me, I will gratefully receive. So thank you very much indeed. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think we have a slide just to take a quick look at what's coming up next.
Yeah. We have, first of all, Maureen, I don't know if you want to just say something about that, just a couple of words.
Sure. On Friday evening, we are going to have a vigil that will be silent and also poetry. It'll be near the City Hall, probably on the Anglesey Street side, from 5 to 6. And we're holding the earth and we're holding all the living beings in that vigil. So please come join us. We would love to have you there.
Thank you.
And then we'll have another speaker coming up in May, I believe. So we really appreciate. There we go. And Jane, who's here with us now and was just chatting a little bit, is going to be the person who shares with us in May. And that's a gorgeous representation, Jane.
Thanks.
We'll be talking about Joanna Macy's work, and she's absolutely amazing. So thank you all. Thank you all for being here. If you have feedback, I think that I think info at Elders for Earth. If you look at where you get the announcement from, if you'd like to give us some feedback about what you would like from this group of people that is coming together, because that's my other question. Community is going to may look different now. I think about Martin Luther King and the beloved community, and how we create community now when it's so critically important. So thank you all. And I will say good night. And Mary or Frank or Eileen or Terry, is there anybody else who has something they'd like to offer before we close? Hope to see you Friday evening at the City Hall in Cork City.